I'm going to be talking about one particular issue with regard to aging, and that's the source and preferences of older people for long-term care. That is long-term care, which would include residential or institutional care, as well as community-based services. I think it was interesting that aging did not come up at all, I don't think, in the list of challenges that Clay put up. I like to think of aging as kind of seismic in some sense. That is, as the plates of the earth kind of gradually grind, so is the aging population moving forward. And it does represent, I think, if not a hidden challenge, certainly a challenge that is being addressed maybe a little bit too late in China, but it's going to require a lot of focus and attention, certainly in the future. I'm going to talk about several things in my presentation. First is a demographic profile of the aging of the population and the, what's called the disease burden that will impose on China and its families and its government. How changes in the population profile, mostly due to reduced fertility, has changed the family structure in the Chinese family. Then I'm going to branch into an empirical presentation, show you some examples of preferences for care by older individuals. The opinions and values and demands and preferences of older people are often ignored in most of the literature. It's more about what policymakers think. So I'm going to look more at the demand side of elder care. And then talk briefly about implications for public policy, which will at least tangentially get to possible solutions. So thinking about this in some detail, we of course have an aging population in China. I'll show you some of the gross numbers in a second. But what that is the result of primarily is fertility decline, right? Smaller families. Family change is important because the family represents the key resource that older people rely on for their elder care needs. The formal sector, of course, is just beginning to kind of wake up and then develop strategies to deal with this increased demand of the aging population, the reduction in family size, which is putting both pressure on children, but also opening up opportunities for alternative ways of serving the elderly. This figure is pretty standard. It shows you the share of the population 65 and over. Rather than using the conventional 60 and over that's used in China, I show you 65 so you can see a comparison with the United States. And I can't see the right year, but somewhere in a few decades, China will surpass proportionately the representation of older people in its population. And if you use 60 and over, it comes to almost a third, maybe 33, 34% of the population by its own definition will be elderly by 2050. Now, that is historically unprecedented, and certainly in a country as large as China represents a major challenge, not only there, but around the world. Not only that, aging is not occurring equally in urban and rural sectors of China, and these are extrapolations by the demographer Zhang Yi and his colleagues looking at aging in rural China, which you see in the top, and urban China on the bottom. Projections out several decades are often dangerous, we know, in any event, but in terms of doing it between urban and rural China, we know that there's forced urbanization, we know there's reclassification of urban into rural sectors, so we have to take this with a grain of salt, but it's very clear, at least these patterns are pretty wide, that aging is occurring more rapidly in rural China, a lot of that due to the rural to urban migration that's occurring in the working age population. Along with this change is the increase in China's, China's life expectancy. And you see a pretty steady rise from 1950 into the present, approaching 80 years of age. My colleague, the late Hans Rosling at University of Stockholm, epidemiologist, has done extensive studies of life expectancy in China comparing to other countries, and finds that, for instance, the survival rate, the longevity of older people in Shanghai equals that of the longevity or life expectancy in Italy, the country of Italy. So it's very much, you might call it first world statistic, but if you look at rural China, sub-Saharan Africa becomes a better comparison for life expectancy. So great inequalities, both in terms of survival, but also I would say quality of life, because the health situation of older people in rural China is markedly worse. So life expectancy is one thing to look at, but the other is healthy life expectancy, or flipping the coin, unhealthy life expectancy. And if you look just at the two bars on the left, which summarizes it pretty well, this has changed between 2000 and 2012 in both the life expectancy and the active life expectancy. So you can see that the top line in the red, life expectancy was 71 in 2000 and 75 in 2012, but healthy life expectancy was 64 in 2000 and 68 in 12 years later. Now, the way to see this is what's the number of years people can be expected to live with a disability, and that's the difference between those two numbers. So the difference between 64 and 71 is 7, and the difference between 68 and 75 is also 7. So unhealthy life expectancy is not diminished. The same number of years people can be expected to live before death with a disability. So this could be good news and bad news, depending on if the glass is half empty or half full in your interpretation. But clearly, there's been no reduction in the number of years of disability. And why is this important? Because 7 years might not seem like a long time to spend with a disability in old age, but now multiply that through the population of China, and you have a lot of disability years to think about. And one way to see this is in the WHO report looking at chronic disease burden of care, and you see 3 years. I guess we're closer to 2020, so we're closer to the green bar, but you see where it's going in red, and these are sheer numbers of people at different ages who have a chronic disease. And what you'll see here, of course, is bulging out in the, let's say, 60 to 80 range, primarily because there are more people in that age range, but this is going to be the population that China will be needing to serve by whatever public policies evolve over the next few years to serve its chronically disabled elderly population. Now, I don't need to tell people in this room that fertility decline has been pretty dramatic, even preceding the one-child policy and after it as well. The consequences, I think, play out in multiple sectors of its society, from educating its workforce and being competitive in the global market. But in terms of family, now I'm a family sociologist, so I'm going to focus in on what's happening at the family level. We have the 4-2-1, or what used to be the 4-2-1 problem, now the 4-2-2 with the two-child policy. But the family structure is not going to really change much as a result of this increase in the child's policy. Now, what you see here is an example of a hypothetical family with one child, 2 parents, and 4 grandparents. Now, the amount of care burden that's put on that single child can be quite heavy. They might also be caring for grandparents. We've seen this in our other research. And you have the little prince phenomenon here, where middle-aged and older people are doting on that single child, which is probably another issue. But I'm more concerned here with what are the care obligations and the care capacity of these single children, and how do older people see their care needs being met with smaller families? Not only that, families that are increasingly without a son. So the questions I'm going to ask here, what are the preferred sources of care in current Chinese population? With smaller and sonless families, is there a shift away from family care and toward an interest, or at least willingness, to use residential care? And are there urban-rural differences in these preferences for care? I'm going to rely on a data source that I've had some intimate connection with. I've served on the advisory board to develop the survey that was fielded initially in 2014 by Renmin University. Professor Du Peng in charge of this effort. It's a longitudinal study. There's more data in 2016. I'm not sure how far they'll go beyond that. Consists of about 11,500 older people, 60 and over, in 28 provinces in China. For what I'm going to show you, we use almost 10,000 respondents who have a child who's at least 25 or over, both in rural and urban hukou, and you see the numbers there, 44,000 urban, 4,900 rural. The survey itself focuses on various aspects of health, family life, and aspects of mental health and various forms of well-being. So I'm going to focus on three particular questions in this survey. One is, how do older people see responsibility for care of the aged in China? And do they see the government playing a role or primary role, children playing a primary role, in your own self or your spouse, your household provision as a source, or all of these sources together, like multiple sources coming together to care for older people? Second, where is the preferred place of support? Where do older people prefer to get care should they need it? And we ask them whether it should be their own home, their children's home, or a residential facility. And finally, and I'm going to go more in depth on this after I show you some basic results, what is their willingness to use residential care, specifically a nursing home type arrangement? And we asked questions under what conditions would they use this kind of care. And the biggest reason would be health, right? So if they were experiencing a health crisis or health catastrophe or chronic condition, would they use a nursing home or residential care then? Would they use it because of loneliness, that they needed more group interaction? Or would they use it because of some sort of family strain or the inability of families to provide for them? So we gave them a longer list than this, and I'm going to kind of simplify it to, would they be willing to use it under any of these conditions, or would they just never want to use it under any condition? And that's what I'm going to focus on at the end. So giving you a kind of a snapshot of the responsibility for care seen from the point of view of older adults, and this is separated by urban and rural. You can see what jumps out at you is the reliance on children, especially in rural China, where 59% say that children should have the major responsibility for caring for older people. So this is worded in kind of a third-person way, so it's not about whether you want to rely on your children, but should older people rely on their children? So there's a little bit of remove to that, but we think it also might get to a more honest type answer. And you can see the urban-rural difference is quite striking, with only 39% preferring children in urban areas. You'll also see the role of the government is pretty minimal in this. Higher in urban than in rural China, as you might expect, 14% compared to 9%. The kind of self-reliance, right? I'm going to rely on myself or my spouse without any outside help, is much more prevalent in rural China. Almost a quarter feel that they should be self-reliant. What about the location where they prefer to get elder care? We asked whether they should get it in their own home, their children's home, residential facility, or some other form. And of course, what you see is most people, both in urban and rural China, prefer to get care in their own home. It's higher in urban China than in rural, and what makes up that difference is the expectation to, and this is their own expectation, to receive care within their children's home. That is requiring them to move into their kid's home, most likely a son, to help take care of them. The final question I'm going to talk about is whether they would be willing to move into a residential facility and the various conditions. We grouped all the conditions together. So under some condition, maybe they would be willing to use a nursing home versus under no condition, no way, no how, right? And here you can see that the majority of both say no way, no how. Under no condition will I ever move to a residential facility, but that negative reaction is more prevalent in rural than in urban China. So the urban Chinese elderly are more willing, 36%, to entertain at least the use of a nursing home under some family or health condition. Finally, I'm going to show you the distribution of this last question about willingness to use a nursing home by education, family size, and the presence or absence of sons, which you might imagine would be relevant, and they turn out to be. So very briefly, this is 3 educational levels: less than high school educated, or beyond high school, which is a relatively small number, but in the hundreds, so we could analyze it. And you can see a pretty good gradient here. So with more education, there's a stronger willingness to use residential care. Almost 50% of urban elderly with a higher degree than high school expressed a willingness to use nursing homes. So this could reflect cultural values, family situations, resources, economic resources, and so on. But the same thing holds in rural China in terms of the educational gradient, even though it's much lower, as we saw before, less willing overall to use, but it still follows the same educational pattern, more willingness to use with greater education. What about family size? Well, again, urban and rural with 4 different family sizes, 1, 2, 3, or 4 or more children. And you see that urban elderly with 1 child, they're half, 50%, 51% of them are willing to use a residential facility. So that's just about half of elders with a single child, which is a very common family structure within urban China, even in the generation that we're looking at. You see the pattern going down as family size increases. Willingness to use a nursing home goes down, right? Because the expectation here would be that the family and children to help take care of them. Again, the same thing's true in rural China. Family size has the same negative gradient. Larger families means less willingness to use a nursing home, even though it's all lower than for urban. Now, you might ask, well, the larger families might be more likely to have sons, right, to take care. They're the kind of primary supporters of older people, even still, at least the cultural values point in that direction. So how do we tease this out? Well, I'm going to show you the next slide when we consider family size and having a son together. And what you see is for urban, now these percentages are not additive. These are the percentage of people who express a willingness to use residential care under 4 conditions: urban and rural, having no son, and having a son. So the family sizes with no sons are, of course, all daughters. So what you see is in urban China, there's not much of a difference. Family size doesn't really make a difference whether you have a son or not, or looking at it the other way, having a son doesn't make a difference if your family is large, right? You can have all daughters and you'll still express the same interest in residential care. But if you look at rural China, you see quite a big difference in the single-child families. If your single child is a daughter, then your willingness to use residential care is much higher than if your single child is a son. Okay, so there's more insecurity, we could kind of say, if your only child in a rural China is a daughter, because they are not the culturally appropriate provider, especially in rural China, where there's more, I think, migration into the village of the husband. So these are the takeaway points I want to summarize. Older adults prefer family care. Overall, both in urban and rural China, prefer to remain at home or live with their children. And this is especially exaggerated in rural areas of China. Residential care is preferred by a minority, but it's endorsed more in urban than in rural areas. About half of higher educated urbanites are willing to consider residential care, probably due to their greater access to resources, but perhaps with a more, call it a modern view of family responsibility. Those with smaller families are willing to use residential care. More than half of single-child urban parents Now, this single-child urban parents is going to grow because we're just kind of hitting the beginning of the one-child policy in this study at this age. Now, the next wave will have more and more people with smaller families to look at. So the trends are moving toward smaller families. In rural areas, those with single daughters are more likely to consider residential care than those with single son families. So still in rural China, there's greater insecurity about what that single daughter will or won't provide for you when you need it. So several implications. First, although there seemed to be very little support for government intervention and government-provided services and programs, the demographic changes in China, mostly fertility decline, population aging, and increase in disease burden, may move China toward developing long-term care insurance, like we've seen developed in Korea and Japan, of course with much larger numbers and with perhaps a kind of middle-income trap that was mentioned before in terms of maybe problematic issues in terms of funding these kind of programs. The long-term care industry, we know, is growing in the private sector, may target older adults with resources, such as higher educated. Not only that, those older people with higher educated children, which we have examples of, but I don't have time to report, as well as those with smaller families and those without sons. This would be kind of market segments that long-term care would try to approach. And just two other points. Segments of the population where there's greater insecurity or uncertainty about getting care would, I think, be a way to at least roll out long-term care insurance, long-term care programs to at least start down this road of trying to shore up what we might see here as a gap in terms of family support for older people. And finally, you saw that a lot of, a majority or many older people prefer to live in their own homes, prefer to be self-reliant, prefer to be in the community. So the development of community-based long-term care to serve people in their own homes is still embryonic in China. It exists in some form, but it's far from universal and far from available to most people. This might require a redefinition of filial piety to include paying for those services on the part of children. And I think we're seeing some movement toward that area in terms of cultural values, but that kind of shift is going to take probably a generation to occur, but I think it will, and then children will be responsible for paying or somehow supporting the service sector rather than doing it directly themselves. So I'm out of time, and I thank you for your attention.